The Kokoda track campaign constituted one of the central conflicts of World War II. Fought between Allied and Japanese land forces along the 100-kilometer Kokoda track, the campaign was motivated by Japan's desire to seize unopposed control of the Pacific. By gaining control first of Port Moresby, then launching an offensive, largely unopposed, on Australia itself. By obtaining bases in the South Pacific, Japan could control shipping and trade. Following the fall of Singapore in early 1942, Allied fears that Japan would invade Australia grew, with the Prime Minister John Curtin appealing for military support from the US, whilst returning some troops from the Middle East as a garrison against a potential attack. Japan held complete strategic supremacy over the Allies at this stage, thanks to a swift campaign that was highlighted by their attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan had successfully overrun many European and American possessions. Starting in the 1800s, Japan had rigorously transitioned away from their isolationist foreign policy of Sakoku and became a competitive world power under the lead of the right-wing Imperial Rule Party and Shintoist monarchy, establishing a totalitarian one-party state concerned solely with expanding imperialist power, particularly in China. As time wore on, this agenda provoked conflict and hostility naturally, with Western nations' relations progressively degrading. Pre-existing treaties and commercial agreements were abandoned with the USA in 1940, and Japan was forced to act to preserve the foundations of their interventionist policy. In 1941, the US lost their worst defeat in the Philippines, which caused Australia to reconsider its own defensive strategies, which were largely dependent on British and American support, which could no longer be counted upon. Meanwhile, Allied Commander Douglas MacArthur began developing his own airfields for the defence of Port Moresby in May of 1942. Australian forces were deployed to Port Moresby in June, and were soon forced into action following the Japanese invasion. The Australian forces in the Kokoda track campaign were poorly trained, ill-disciplined, and more acquainted with labour than war. The Australian forces had been equipped with dated, underpowered weapons, nothing more powerful than a machine gun, and inadequate clothing and ammunition, whereas Japan had sent some of their best trained troops to invade Papua, led by Lieutenant General Hori Tomatiro, who was experienced in successful jungle campaigns in Indonesia and Malaya, and they were accompanied by a strong artillery detachment and some aerial support. Australian foot soldiers' atrocious conditions of war can be witnessed through the personal, primary accounts of one Private Clark. Thanks to the shortage of supplies and high altitude, troops frequently found themselves at near-zero temperatures, and Clark elaborates on this by looking at an average week in the campaign in 1942. Details the week of August 24 to 30, looking at events witnessed firsthand. On Wednesday the 26th, Clark's battalion was wet through the night, with no dry clothes. Later on Thursday, he speaks of his constant longing for home. On Friday, his commander Moore passed away. All Clark had to add to this was bad luck. While on Saturday, there were bullets everywhere, with the condition of hell on earth amongst the clouds in the mountains. While the Japanese troops regularly suffered through the same struggles, particularly environmentally, Australia's ill-preparedness for the campaign, coupled with an ongoing row between the commanders MacArthur from the USA and the unpopular Australian Blamey, who reportedly accused his men of running like rats from a futile fight, led to underestimation and ill consideration of the inhospitability of this climate, which all combined to make the Australian victory ascend to the status of myth, an integral part of our Anzac legend, and an enduring tale of the human condition against an oppressive, invasive disruptor. Now, the conflict itself began in July of 1942, as the Imperial Japanese Army decided the best way to capture Papua and thus gain a foothold in Australia would be through a 100-kilometer march from Gurna through the forbidding Owen Stanley Hills in central New Guinea to eventually claim Port Moresby across land. They easily pushed well inland, around 30 kilometers, to the Kumasi River with ease. Here, a ragged group of Australian and Papuan soldiers waited, and command of the town swung from Australia to Japan to Australia and finally back to Japan. But following this early triumph, the Japanese continued to surge forward, driving the Australians back along the trail through the Owen-Stanley Range. By September, a mere 2 months after Japan's landing in Gunma, they were within 50 kilometers of Port Moresby. They could see the lights of the town. By this time, Australians had waited at the Imita Ridge, about 5 kilometers along from Japan's present position. And by this stage the conditions of jungle warfare had well and truly taken hold for Japan and for Australia. But Japan's supply line was isolated to the north, and its perilous track ensured that they couldn't easily supply the front line with ammunition and supplies. The aforementioned Australian withdrawn troops from the Middle East, from John Curtin, then supplanted the defence, and from September the 28th began steadily counterattacking the Japanese forces, pushing them back to Kokoda by early November and confining them beyond the Kumasi River just 12 days later. Here they captured the Japanese commander Hori, drowning him in an attempted escape. In early December, the Allied forces retook Gunma, and 1 month later they eradicated the Japanese presence through a comprehensive victory at Buna. The Kokoda Trail was a significant turning point of World War II, halting Japanese expansion after a succession of European-based capitulations. It comprehensively reoriented the dynamic of the Pacific Theatre, where Japan's campaigns had been marked with unbridled victory in the last 2, 3, 4 years. Kokoda began the slow erosion of Japanese defences that eventually led to the USSR's formal defeat of Japan in 1945. Though seemingly insignificant in terms of casualties, a relatively petty 3,000 deaths that were nothing in the scale of the tens of millions suffered through World War II was suffered throughout the campaign, Kokoda still held lasting significance by denying Japan a foothold in the South Pacific, thus limiting their formidable naval and air options. The Kokoda Trail was a significant factor in turning the tide of World War II against Japan. Thank you for listening. This was a documentary by Elliot Cook.